The weight of the evening rested heavily on my shoulders as I sat at the dining table, staring at the modest spread before me. My wife, Caroline, sat across from me, her face a mask of serenity. To her left was Jake, our neighbor and my oldest friend. His easy grin and carefree demeanor used to feel like the safest place in the world. Now, it was the sharpest thorn in my side. It started 5 years ago, though at the time, I had no inkling of the storm brewing. Caroline and I had been together for nearly a decade. We were one of those couples who everyone said were perfect together. You know the type, matching Christmas sweaters, anniversary trips to tropical resorts, inside jokes that could light up a room. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. I worked long hours as an engineer, and while I convinced myself I was doing it for the family, the truth was simpler: I was running. Caroline found solace elsewhere. I didn't know it then, of course. That revelation came later, after years of her gentle but insistent nudges to relax a little more, and Jake's laughter echoing from our living room when he came over to help with the occasional fix-it project. Jake was charismatic, the kind of guy who could charm an entire room without breaking a sweat. When my job kept me late, he kept Caroline company, or so I thought. After all, he'd been a part of our lives for years, practically family. How could I have guessed that the man who helped hang the nursery curtains for our son, Ethan, was betraying me? The evening they sat across from me was not like any other. I had summoned them both here with a calm, calculated precision that terrified even me. Ethan was spending the night at a friend's house, and for once, there would be no distractions. "Let's toast," I said, raising my glass of whiskey. Caroline hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her wine. Jake raised his beer, his grin faltering as he noticed the chill in my tone. "To honesty," I said, locking eyes with Caroline. She flinched, the color draining from her face. "Donald," she began, but I raised a hand to stop her. "I'll talk, Caroline. You'll listen." Jake shifted uncomfortably, the usual confidence gone from his posture. Good, I thought. He should feel uncomfortable. He should feel every ounce of the betrayal I carried. "Jake," I said, turning my gaze to him, "did you know Caroline once told me I was a rock? The one thing she could always count on." Yeah," he stammered, rubbing the back of his neck. "Of course, Don. You've always been solid, man." "Funny," I continued, my voice like ice, "because for 5 years, while I was being her rock, she was in your bed." The room plunged into silence. Caroline's wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the table. Jake's face turned pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Caroline started, but I slammed my fist on the table, making the dishes jump. "Don't," I said, my voice cracking with emotion. "Don't you dare insult me by denying it." Her eyes welled with tears, but I had no sympathy to give. Jake looked as though he wanted to bolt, but I wouldn't let him off that easy. "Sit," I barked, and he froze. The unraveling had begun months earlier, with small, insidious clues that grew impossible to ignore. It was an overheard snippet of conversation between neighbors, a too casual laugh from Jake that lingered in my mind, and finally, a text message on Caroline's phone that she had been careless enough to leave unlocked. The text was from Jake, and it wasn't the kind of message you sent to a friend's wife. Once the seed of suspicion was planted, it didn't take long for me to find the truth. I hired a private investigator, a quiet man with an unassuming presence, and within weeks, he handed me a dossier thick with evidence. Pictures, timestamps, hotel receipts. It was all there, in black and white. The affair wasn't just real, it was calculated and sustained. Back at the table, Jake finally found his voice. "Don, listen, man, You what?" I snapped. "You're sorry. You're sorry that you took advantage of my trust. Of our friendship. Of my marriage." "Donald, please," Caroline interjected. "We can talk about this." "Oh, we'll talk, Caroline," I spat. "We'll talk about how I threw your things out of the house. They're by the garbage can, by the way. You can pick them up on your way to Jake's." Her hand flew to her mouth, muffling a sob. Jake stood, his face a mix of anger and shame. "You don't have to do this," he said, his voice rising. "It's not just her fault." I laughed bitterly. "Oh, I know. Trust me, I've got plenty of blame to go around. But let me make one thing very clear, you're both out of my life. Starting now." They didn't argue further. Jake left first, his head down, his once confident swagger reduced to a pitiful shuffle. Caroline lingered, her tear-streaked face searching mine for something, mercy, perhaps, but I had none to offer. When the door finally closed behind her, the silence in the house was deafening. Later that night, I sat on the porch, watching as the wind scattered the last of autumn's leaves. The anger that had carried me through the confrontation ebbed, leaving behind a hollow ache. I thought of Ethan, of how I would explain this to him, of how his world would never be the same. And yet, beneath the pain, there was a glimmer of something else, freedom. For the first time in years, I could see the chains I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Tomorrow, I told myself. Tomorrow, I would begin again. The morning after the storm was almost too quiet. The house, my house now, I reminded myself, seemed emptier than I'd expected. I sat in the kitchen, nursing my coffee, staring at the spot where Caroline had sat just hours earlier, tears streaming down her face. Her words echoed in my mind, "Donald, I can explain." Explain? What explanation could there possibly be for 5 years of betrayal? For the lies, the secrecy, the mockery of our vows. I had spent the night pacing the house, replaying everything she'd ever said to me, every moment I'd brushed off a gut feeling or ignored a red flag. By the time the sun rose, my anger had dulled into something colder, sharper. I wasn't done. Not yet. I decided to call Ethan's school. I told them I'd be picking him up early and made arrangements for us to stay at my sister Hannah's place for the next few days. It wasn't just about the distance, it was about giving myself space to think, to figure out how to shield my son from the wreckage. He was only 8, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened but old enough to sense that something was wrong. Hannah was waiting for me when I arrived. She lived on the outskirts of town, in a quiet cul-de-sac surrounded by tall oaks. The moment I pulled into her driveway, she stepped out onto the porch, arms crossed and her expression half worried, half determined. I didn't want to say this over the phone, I began, after Ethan had run inside to find his cousins. But it's bad, hon. It's real bad. She nodded, motioning for me to follow her inside. We settled into the living room, the fireplace crackling in the background. I told her everything, the affair, the years of lies, the confrontation with Caroline and Jake. By the time I was done, her face was pale, her mouth a thin line. I knew something was up with her, she said finally. I mean, I didn't want to assume, but, 5 years, Don. How did she even manage to keep it going that long? Jake's just across the street, I said bitterly. I made it easy for her. Trusted her, trusted him. They didn't even have to try hard. Hannah shook her head, her jaw tightening. What are you gonna do now? First, I've got to figure out how to tell Ethan. Then, I need a lawyer. That evening, after Ethan was asleep, I started sorting through the evidence the private investigator had given me. At first, I hadn't wanted to look too closely, knowing was bad enough, but now I needed the details. Each photograph, each receipt, each message added fuel to the fire burning in my chest. The pictures hit the hardest. Caroline and Jake, laughing together at a bar, their heads close. The two of them at a motel just outside of town. Caroline walking into Jake's house while I was out of town for a work trip. The timestamps on the photos were like daggers, special occasions, holidays, even our anniversary. I flipped to the section with text messages and paused. The investigator had flagged a specific exchange, highlighting it in bold. Jake, we have to be more careful. He's starting to suspect something. Caroline, don't worry. Donald doesn't have a clue. He's too wrapped up in his work. I felt like someone had punched me in the gut. It wasn't just the affair, it was the arrogance, the complete lack of respect. They didn't just cheat, they mocked me while they did it. The next day, I met with a divorce attorney. Her name was Maria Sanchez, and from the moment I walked into her office, I knew she wasn't one to mess around. Her dark eyes studied me as I explained the situation, her pen flying across her notepad. Do you have proof of the affair? She asked, her voice sharp and professional. I handed over the folder. Maria flipped through it, her expression neutral, though I thought I saw a flicker of disgust when she reached the text messages. This is solid, she said, closing the folder with a decisive snap. We'll file for divorce immediately. Your son, how much does he know? Nothing yet, I admitted. I don't even know how to start that conversation. She nodded. We'll handle custody carefully. Judges favor stability, and from what you've told me, Caroline isn't exactly winning any Parent of the Year awards. Before I left, she gave me a piece of advice that stuck with me: stay calm, Mr. Blackwell. It's going to be a fight, but don't let anger drive your decisions. You've got a son to think about. That evening, as I tucked Ethan into bed, I thought about Maria's words. I'd spent so much time stewing in my own anger that I hadn't considered what this would mean for him. I sat on the edge of his bed, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Hey, bud," I said softly. "There's something I need to talk to you about." Ethan's big brown eyes blinked up at me, full of trust. "What is it, Dad?" "It's about your mom and me," I began, choosing my words carefully. "Things are going to change a little. We're going to be living apart for a while." "Why?" he asked, his voice small. I hesitated, my heart aching at the confusion on his face. Sometimes grown-ups have problems that they can't fix. "But I promise you, no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you." Ethan nodded slowly, his lower lip trembling. "Can I still see Mom?" "Of course," I said, though the thought of sharing custody with Caroline made my stomach churn. "She loves you very much." I sat with him until he fell asleep, my mind racing with the implications of what lay ahead. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting Ethan, giving him a sense of stability in the chaos Caroline and Jake had created. The next morning, I got a text from Jake. "We need to talk. Face to face." My first instinct was to ignore it, but something about the tone made me pause. What could he possibly want now? Apologies weren't going to cut it. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "Fine. My place. Tonight." That night, as I waited for Jake to show up, I felt the tension coil tighter with each passing minute. I didn't know what I expected: an apology, an excuse, maybe even a fight. But what I wasn't prepared for was the secret Jake revealed that turned everything upside down. "Donald," he began, his voice low and hesitant, "there's something I have to tell you about Caroline." Jake sat on the couch across from me, his shoulders slumped and his head hung low. The same man who used to walk into my house like he owned the place now looked like he wanted to disappear into the fabric of the cushions. It was a stark contrast to the Jake I thought I knew, the confident, charming guy who could joke his way out of anything. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, staring him down. The tension between us was thick enough to choke on. I wasn't about to make this easy for him. "Well?" I said, my voice cold. "You said you wanted to talk. So, talk." Jake shifted uncomfortably, rubbing his palms against his jeans. "Donald, man, I know I messed up. I never wanted it to go this far." I barked out a laugh, sharp and humorless. 5 years, Jake. 5 years. You think that just happened? You didn't mess up. You made a choice. Repeatedly. He winced, but I wasn't done. You came into my house, sat at my table, played with my son, while you were sleeping with my wife. And now you're sitting here like you're the victim. So, again, what do you want? For a moment, he just stared at the floor, his jaw working like he was trying to force the words out. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "There's more to this, Don. Stuff you don't know. Stuff you need to know." I leaned forward, my patience wearing thin. "Spit it out, Jake. I don't have all night." He took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't just an affair. Caroline, she's been using me. Manipulating me." I frowned, skepticism creeping in. "What are you talking about? You're a grown man. No one made you do anything." Jake's eyes snapped up to meet mine, desperation shining in them. "I'm serious, Don. It started out as, I don't know, just a mistake. Something stupid. But over time, she started controlling me. Threatening me. Threatening you?" I repeated, incredulous. "With what?" He hesitated, and I could almost see the war raging in his head. Finally, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Here," he said, unlocking it and handing it to me. "See for yourself." I took the phone, my heart pounding. On the screen was a text thread between Jake and Caroline. I scrolled through the messages, my stomach twisting tighter with every line I read. "Caroline, if you don't keep this quiet, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done. Your wife, your boss, your kids. Jake, please, Caroline. I don't want to hurt anyone. Caroline, then do what I say. Meet me tonight. Same place as always. Message after message painted a picture I hadn't expected. Jake wasn't just a willing participant in the affair, he was being blackmailed. Caroline had something on him, and she wasn't afraid to use it. I looked up at him, my anger tempered slightly by confusion. Why would she do this? What could she possibly have on you? Jake swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting in his lap. Before all this started, I made some bad decisions. Got involved in some shady deals at work. Caroline found out, don't ask me how, and she used it to keep me in line. Said if I didn't go along with what she wanted, she'd ruin my life. I sat back, trying to process what he was saying. So, what? You're telling me she forced you into this? That you had no choice? He shook his head. I'm not saying I'm innocent, Dawn. I made my choices, and I'll own that. But you need to understand, Caroline isn't who you think she is. She's dangerous. The room fell silent as I let his words sink in. Dangerous? It sounded absurd, this was the woman I'd shared my life with, the mother of my child. But then again, the Caroline I thought I knew would never have cheated on me for half a decade. What do you expect me to do with this? I finally asked, my voice hard. Feel sorry for you. Forgive you. No, Jake said quickly. I thought you deserved to know. She's not done, Dawn. If she thinks you're a threat, she'll come after you, too. I scoffed. She's got nothing on me. You sure about that? Jake countered, his voice low. Because she had nothing on me either, until she went looking. That hit harder than I wanted to admit. I prided myself on keeping my life in order, but Caroline knew me better than anyone. If she wanted to dig up dirt, who's to say she couldn't find something? Why tell me this now? I asked, narrowing my eyes. What's in it for you? Jake hesitated, then looked me square in the eye. I'm trying to make things right. I can't undo what I've done, but maybe I can help you protect yourself. Protect Ethan. Ethan. The thought of my son being caught in Caroline's web made my blood run cold. For all my anger, I'd been so focused on my own betrayal that I hadn't considered how far Caroline might go to get what she wanted. After Jake left, I sat alone in the quiet house, the folder of evidence on the table in front of me. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of everything pressing down on me. I thought about the life I'd built with Caroline, the memories we'd shared, the family we'd created. How much of it had been real? How much had been a carefully constructed illusion? I didn't know who to trust anymore. Not Jake. Not Caroline. And maybe not even myself. The only thing I knew for certain was this, the fight wasn't over. If Caroline thought she could manipulate me the way she had Jake, she was in for a rude awakening. I picked up my phone and dialed Maria Sanchez. Maria, I said when she answered. I need to take this to the next level. Whatever it takes, I want to make sure Caroline can't hurt Ethan, or me, ever again. The wheels were in motion, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was still ahead. Whatever secrets Caroline was hiding, I was going to uncover them. And when I did, there'd be no going back. The morning after Jake's confession, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only scratching the surface of whatever mess Caroline had pulled me into. Dangerous. Manipulative. The words kept circling in my head, making it impossible to focus. I had barely touched my breakfast when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was Maria Sanchez. Morning, Mr. Blackwell, she said briskly. I've been reviewing your case overnight, and I need to know something. Do you have any reason to believe your wife might retaliate if she feels backed into a corner? Her question sent a chill down my spine. Retaliate how? Maria sighed. Legally or otherwise. If she's as calculated as you've described, she won't just roll over and accept the divorce terms. People like her rarely do. I thought about Jake's warning, about the text messages threatening to blow up his life. The Caroline I married was passionate, sometimes sharp-tongued, but I never would have thought she'd resort to blackmail, until now. I don't know, I admitted. But she's not going to take this lightly. Then we need to get ahead of her, Maria said. I'll file for a formal deposition. If she has skeletons in her closet, we'll drag them out. By mid-afternoon, I was back in my old neighborhood, parked a few houses down from Jake's place. The idea of being this close to him still made my skin crawl, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that he had more information I needed. If Caroline really was a threat, I had to know exactly what I was dealing with. Jake answered the door looking rough. His eyes were bloodshot, and his usually smug expression was replaced with something that almost resembled guilt. "Donald," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." I crossed the threshold, trying to ignore the memories of Caroline sitting on this very couch. The place smelled like stale beer and desperation. "Why am I here, Jake?" I asked bluntly. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding my eyes. "I've been thinking about what I told you last night. There's something else. Something I didn't know how to say." I crossed my arms, my patience wearing thin. "Just spit it out." Jake looked at me, his face pale. "Caroline's been siphoning money." "What are you talking about?" My heart started pounding. "She's been pulling cash from your joint account. Not big chunks, just small enough amounts that you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I didn't think much of it at first, but now. I think she's been stashing it somewhere." The implications hit me like a freight train. "How do you know this?" "I saw her once," he admitted. "She had a stash of cash in her car. When I asked her about it, she said it was for emergencies. But now, looking back, I think she was preparing for something." That night, I dug into our finances. Sure enough, Jake wasn't lying. Caroline had been withdrawing small sums of money regularly, $200 here, $300 there. Over the course of the last year, it added up to thousands. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pattern was unmistakable. Maria's voice echoed in my head, "If she's as calculated as you've described, she won't just roll over." Suddenly, my phone buzzed, making me jump. It was a text, from Caroline. "We need to talk. Tomorrow. My lawyer will be there." I stared at the message, my grip tightening around the phone. She was making her move. The next day, I met Maria outside the neutral office space where we'd agreed to meet. Caroline arrived a few minutes later, her expression calm, almost smug. Her lawyer was a sharp-looking man in an expensive suit, the kind of guy who probably charged by the minute. As we sat down, Caroline leaned back in her chair, looking far too comfortable for my liking. "Donald," she began, her tone as sweet as syrup. "This doesn't have to get messy. We can make this amicable." I clenched my jaw. "Amicable? After what you've done?" Her lawyer cut in before she could respond. "Let's stay professional, Mr. Blackwell. My client is willing to negotiate terms that are fair to both parties." "Fair?" Maria interjected, her voice calm but steely. "Your client has spent years deceiving my client, draining his resources, and compromising the stability of their family. I'd hardly call that fair." Caroline's mask slipped for just a moment, her lips tightening. "I don't know what lies you've been feeding your lawyer, Donald, but if you think you're getting everything, you're dreaming." "I don't want everything," I said, my voice low. "I just want the truth." Caroline's eyes flashed with something I couldn't quite place, anger, maybe, or fear. But she said nothing. When the meeting ended, Maria and I walked out together. "She's hiding something," Maria said. I could see it all over her face. "Whatever she's planning, it's big." I nodded, my mind racing. "Then we need to figure it out, before it's too late." Maria placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, Mr. Blackwell. I've never lost to someone like her." But as I drove back to Hannah's house, a nagging feeling settled in my gut. Caroline wasn't just planning to fight me, she was planning to destroy me. And unless I figured out her next move, she just might succeed. The days following the meeting with Caroline were a blur of preparations. Maria worked tirelessly, combing through every detail of our financial records and assembling evidence that would leave no room for manipulation. Meanwhile, I couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. Caroline's smugness in that meeting wasn't just posturing. She had a plan, and I had to be ready for it. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Late one night, Maria called me, her voice sharp with urgency. "Donald, I've found something," she said. "Caroline has been wiring money to an account under a different name. The transfers are small, but the pattern matches her withdrawals. I tracked the account, it's in Jake's name." The room tilted. "Jake?" I asked, gripping the phone. "You think they're working together?" "I think Caroline's been setting him up," Maria replied. "The account is in his name, but the withdrawals are tied to her actions. She's either preparing to frame him, or they're in deeper than you realized. The next day, I confronted Jake. He was a mess, sweaty, nervous, like he hadn't slept in days. "You've been her fall guy all along," I told him. "Did you even know about the account?" "What?" he stammered, his face pale. "I swear, Dawn, I didn't know." "Caroline must have," he stopped, his eyes widening in realization. "She's going to pin this on me." I didn't need him to say more. This was Caroline's plan: burn everything down and let Jake take the blame. The final showdown came quicker than expected. Maria filed an emergency motion to freeze the account and subpoena the financial records. With Jake's reluctant cooperation, we traced the transactions back to Caroline, uncovering her paper trail. On the day of the hearing, Caroline walked in with that same smug confidence, but as the evidence mounted, her mask cracked. The judge listened as Maria laid out the scheme, the affair, the blackmail, the hidden account. By the time Maria finished, Caroline looked like a cornered animal. "You don't understand," she hissed, her voice breaking. "This isn't what it looks like." The judge wasn't swayed. The financial evidence was irrefutable, and combined with Jake's testimony, Caroline's plan unraveled. The court ruled in my favor: full custody of Ethan, and an equitable division of assets that left her with little room to maneuver. The silence in the house was different that evening. It wasn't the suffocating quiet of betrayal, it was peaceful. Ethan was playing with his cousins at Hannah's, and I sat on the porch, staring at the sunset. For the first time in years, I felt free. Caroline's lies had consumed so much of my life, but now, with the truth out in the open, I could finally start to rebuild. As I sipped my coffee, a text buzzed on my phone. It was from Maria. "Congratulations, Donald. You're free. Take care of yourself and Ethan." I smiled, setting the phone down. Tomorrow was a new day, and for the first time in a long time, it was a future I could look forward to.